I'm not gonna lie, the whole True Detective style approach with lanterns is really growing on me. After the big reveal of Hal Jordan's murder in the 2026 timeline during the pilot, the second episode made absolutely zero effort to address the previous cliffhanger and instead left us with a ticking timer to figure out who the Manhunter is. Even then, the spotlight this week has clearly been on John Stewart, who has had a really interesting encounter and showcased some oddly stunning skills as the next Green Lantern in life. I think it's amazing how the Lantern has adapted multiple Green Lantern characters from the comics who have their own distinctive set of powers. On the surface, it does seem like the show is really an exploration of the cost you pay of being a superhero, or a story about the Guardians of the Universe and how they're absolute assholes. But given how they're playing around with the classic Green Lantern role, it's certainly bound to keep us longtime Lantern fans on our toes. Though I would love to know when Lanterns will finally decide to explore the science fiction related concepts of Green Lantern or the vast cosmic universe that exists in the lore. At this point, I'm sure everyone is more intrigued to know just how did John manage to keep his little green bird alive for such a long time without the power ring, amidst all that rigorous traveling. Well, lucky for you, I've read a decent share of Green Lantern comics, so without waiting another moment, let's dig deep into the panels to discuss just how powerful John could potentially become in Lanterns. John Stewart's failed flying lesson in Lanterns was hardly a setback. Hal and John seem to really be like oil and water. They have very different sets of belief systems and they certainly don't mix. However, every Green Lantern has to follow certain instructions in order to continue deriving their powers from the power ring. As you know, the ring needs to be charged daily, and because Hal didn't bring a physical Green Lantern to charge it, he uses this as an opportunity to heckle John by offering him flying lessons. After waking the trainee up by splashing his face with a bucket of water while he was asleep, Hal hands him over the ring and asks him to try flying, which goes south in the most embarrassing way. He advises John to concentrate his thoughts about flying, but instead of lifting himself in the air, John ends up producing a green bird instead. I mean, sure, birds do fly, but that's not exactly what Hal wanted him to do. Of course, it is soon revealed that the ring has no power left. So Hal tasks John to fly down to Coast City, find a key hidden inside a potato-shaped rock outside his house, find a voice-operated safe that opens a pocket dimension, collect the Green Lantern from inside, feed Hal's absolutely bizarre carnivorous exotic plant pet Earl, and then return back to Rushville, because John had the little green bird perched on his shoulder for longer than he should have. That too after he gave the power ring back to Hal. The Green Lanterns asked him to keep the bird alive with him throughout the journey and bring it back with him to Rushville again. This is exactly what John does, despite being in awe of Hal's rather empty mansion that was gifted to him by a rich guy for saving his son's life. In fact, he even collects Hal's Green Lantern uniform along with the physical Green Lantern, and feeds a beef and bison mix to Earl before leaving. Unfortunately, John was then abducted by aliens from outside Hal's mansion, and even then he tried his best to protect the bird. After they held him captive, sweetly enough, John insisted upon knowing the bird's safety, and even Anton, the leader of the aliens, was genuinely surprised how he kept the bird alive without wearing a ring to power it. So far, the show hasn't explained how John could manage to keep the bird alive, but we've been given pretty strong hints about his extraordinary advanced abilities, which makes me believe that John's connection to the power ring is very different from that of Hal's. For starters, John didn't consciously decide he wanted to create the construct in the form of a bird, and the only reason Hal asked him to concentrate on flight was due to the fact that he used to be a fighter pilot, so the idea of flying came naturally to him. Unfortunately, that instruction barely does John any favors, as his subconscious ends up producing a creature that can fly. Now, when the bird doesn't disappear after Hal takes the ring away, he decides to use this moment as an opportunity to train John by asking him to keep it alive, because if his concentration falters, the construct should end up disappearing. This is exactly what John does, and this is already a very difficult assignment for someone who's barely done any training. So naturally, Hal doesn't expect him to sustain the construct projection beyond the normal limit. But to everyone's surprise, John survives the whole ordeal with Anton and his aliens as they force him to experience the genocide of their world at the hands of the Manhunters, and even then the bird remains alive. That's why the aliens assume that the anomaly was a result of Hal projecting the bird from somewhere else, but that's definitely not the case. The only reason the aliens were shocked is because a Green Lantern construct is normally the visible result of the ring translating will and imagination into green energy. However, John apparently continues maintaining that creation even when the normal connection between lantern and ring is absent. Does that make him some kind of prodigy? Well, it's certainly a mystery we're all trying to crack, right? While Anton is the one who points out the miracle of John being able to manifest something that behaves like a living thing instead of a hollow facsimile, even Hal doesn't seem to understand how it's possible, because creating a living thing is already extremely advanced, but keeping it alive while not wearing the ring is practically impossible. Hal then asks if the bird signifies something deeper as he brought it to life through his subconscious mind, but John responds by casually crushing the bird in his hands until it turns into a cloud of green dust. From the look in his eyes, that suggests he knows more than he's letting on. Maybe the bird could connect to John's childhood, his desire for freedom, his relationship with flight, a memory the series hasn't shown yet, or simply the idea of achieving something naturally that John is struggling to do artificially with the ring. Either way, we all know that this is just John being avoidant, but we do get a whiff of his potential after Hal pays a little visit to Sinestro, who takes a rather keen interest in the rookie. If you've seen the preview for the next episode, you can understand that John's been training for most of his life to be the next Green Lantern, after Hal, and this is a very hardworking man who's also gifted. I think this is just a tease of how his character could potentially become the most gifted Green Lantern, and I can only imagine what he can do once he's actually allowed to access the full power of the ring. You have to understand that Green Lanterns normally use their rings to create constructs, and this is the ring that turns their willpower into physical green objects, as John somehow appears to maintain his construct independently. This could mean that John has an ability beyond normal Lantern powers, and maybe that's what makes him the biggest threat that Hal needs to be aware of. John Stewart's comic book history certainly makes this scene very interesting. In case you ever read the comics, the DC lore has long defined John Stewart through the unusually precise constructs he creates. Not just that, the official DC profile specifies that because of his architectural background, everything he creates is much more structurally complete and is built from the inside rather than as hollow shapes. In that sense, every imagined nut and bolt can be part of the finished construct, and that distinction separates John from Hal in his more instinctive style. The comic lore has also established that John's background in architecture brings a different kind of creativity to the Green Lantern mythos. His imagination worked almost like engineering, with him using willpower to design and build rather than simply conjure things into existence. Because the series has changed parts of John's backstory by giving him a military background instead of an architectural one, I don't think this confirms the bird exists due to the same kind of construct mastery he has in the comics. Even so, the thematic connection is really hard to ignore, as John doesn't use the ring the way Hal does, and despite Hal being the one training him, John's first major creation seems to follow a completely different set of rules. It seems Lanterns is teasing John Stewart's becoming an immensely powerful Green Lantern, to a point that he might even have abilities that Hal Jordan can't conceive of. This again tracks with the comics, as John Stewart is one of the most powerful Green Lanterns, because as a Marine and an architect, Stewart can create extraordinarily detailed and powerful constructs with his ring. This is how, in one of his comic book runs, he even temporarily became the first mortal guardian of the universe. And among other things, in Philip Kennedy Johnson and Montos's Green Lantern War Journal, John creates Ellie, who is a sentient construct modeled on his late sister, who can think and act independently while he is somewhere else. But he was only able to do this after absorbing a primordial cosmic entity called the Godstorm, which effectively elevated him to the status of a cosmic god. John absorbed the Godstorm after destroying the Lightbringer to defeat the Rogue Guardian Koios in Green Lantern issue 12 that was published in 2022, thus gaining cosmic awareness as per the source entity, a power source that will never be extinguished. Having said that, the bigger question here is whether John can create constructs that continue to exist even after the ring is gone. That answer is complicated because a Green Lantern ring channels its user's willpower and transforms it into energy, with the strength of a construct ultimately depending on the Lantern's ability to exert that will. Different comic runs have interpreted this ability in different ways, as some Lanterns can create complex constructs almost instantly, rather than having to mentally build every individual component before putting it together. In some versions, removing the ring from its wearer doesn't immediately erase their constructs, which could explain why John's bird continues to exist in the show. That said, the idea that John could be significantly more powerful than Hal raises some questions. In the comics, Hal Jordan is generally portrayed as the most powerful Green Lantern ever, especially because at one point he even used his ring to recreate Coast City, including its people. Yes, Hal Jordan was being influenced by a powerful cosmic entity at the time, but the feat still demonstrates just how far his abilities can go. Lanterns hasn't shown anything close to that level of power yet, so hopefully the series will take the opportunity to establish that Hal and John can both be incredibly powerful, but just in very different ways. The willpower of any Green Lantern is what influences the powers he derives from the ring. The most important thing to understand about a Green Lantern's power ring is that the ring does not create the Lantern's potential, but rather gives that potential a way to manifest. All the Corps' rings are powered by the green light of willpower, and DC has repeatedly established that the effectiveness of a ring depends on the strength of the person wielding it. The stronger the user's will, the more effectively the ring can turn their thoughts into physical reality. DC itself describes the power rings as weapons whose constructs are limited by the user's willpower and ingenuity. That distinction is important because it means two Lanterns can have exactly the same weapon and still produce radically different results. Sure, the ring provides the energy and the mechanism, but it's the Lantern that provides the imagination, focus, and most importantly, the willpower necessary to make that energy do something. This is also why the rings select people with exceptional willpower in the first place, while also taking the personality of the potential bearer into account. In that sense, Hal Jordan is perhaps the clearest example of what happens when overwhelming willpower is paired with an almost reckless imagination. His constructs are often direct and instinctive because Hal tends to think in terms of action to construct weapons, vehicles, shields, giant fists, or whatever else he needs in the moment. But that simplicity should not be mistaken for a lack of power. DC describes Hal as one of the most legendary lanterns to ever wield a ring, while the official Green Lantern Corps page goes even further by calling him the greatest of all living Green Lanterns. The extreme example to back that claim would be the Emerald Twilight storyline from the early 90s. In Green Lantern Volume 3. After Coast City is destroyed, Hal uses his ring to recreate the city and even restores its dead inhabitants. The feat pushes the idea of willpower to an almost absurd extreme because Hal's not merely creating a weapon or a vehicle, instead he's imposing an enormous detailed construct onto reality because he has the will to make his ring attempt something on that scale. His actions ultimately led him to the central power battery where he transformed into Parallax. But the Coast City sequence remains an extraordinary demonstration of how far Hal's will could drive his ring. Now, compared to him, John Stewart is a completely different way of expressing that same principle, because as I previously mentioned, his background as an architect gives his imagination a more technical and structured quality, which means John's constructs are not hollow as he builds them from the inside out, imagining everything down to the last nut and bolt. That's a perfect example of how Lantern's personality and imagination influences what the ring can do. You have to understand that John's not necessarily using a fundamentally different ring from Hal, he's just using the same power through a fundamentally different mind. Hal can instinctively imagine a weapon and make it appear, while John can mentally design an entire structure, understand how its components should interact, and then use his willpower to turn that design into a functioning construct. This is also why the distinction between Hal Jordan and John Stewart is interesting in more than simply asking which one of them is the stronger Green Lantern. Hal shows us the sheer scale of what willpower can accomplish, while John demonstrates how imagination can determine what that power becomes. And that principle extends beyond constructs. A Green Lantern's will can affect how effectively they maintain defenses, how much force they can exert, and how long they can sustain what they've created. The ring's capabilities are therefore not completely independent of the person wearing it, meaning that if their concentration or resolve breaks down, the effectiveness of the ring can suffer as well. That's also what makes the Green Lantern concept so different from a conventional superpower, as the ring is the tool, but the lantern is the limiting factor. And that's why John's bird is potentially so interesting. If the show is suggesting that John can create something that persists beyond the normal limitations of the ring, it wouldn't necessarily contradict the core Green Lantern mythology. It could instead be pushing the foundational idea to its logical extreme, wherein the more extraordinary John's will and imagination become, the more extraordinary the things he can make the ring accomplish. John's ascended physiology allowed him to use his powers without the ring. I think the most direct comic book precedent for the idea that John Stewart could eventually create constructs without physically wearing a Green Lantern ring comes from his transformation into an ascended being. But there's an important distinction because this is not something John could simply do as an ordinary Green Lantern, as it happens after his abilities evolve far beyond the standard power ring-based ability. As we've discussed, John's transformation happens through the Green Lantern mythology surrounding the Godstorm and the Source. After being exposed to the Godstorm, John's connection to the emotional spectrum fundamentally changes, and rather than merely being a human channeling green energy from a power ring, his own body becomes capable of accessing the power the ring normally channels for him. That's how his physiology ascends to a higher evolutionary level, thus giving him enhanced versions of his normal Lantern abilities. As you know, the Green Lantern ring normally serves as the intermediary between the wielder and the green light of will, but John's ascendant state effectively removes that intermediary, particularly after the Emerald Knight storyline, during the first issue of John Stewart, the Emerald Knight. His newly evolved powers include emotional electromagnetic spectrum manipulation, which allows him to channel the power of will without needing a ring. More importantly, this is not simply the ability to shoot green energy from his body, as his ascendant powers include creating enormous complex hard light constructs with little effort, alongside projecting energy directly from himself. This makes the storyline particularly relevant to the idea of John's bird in Lantern. The comics have established that there is a version of John Stewart whose ability to manifest willpower has become an intrinsic part of his physiology, rather than something dependent on an external weapon, and in that case, his body essentially becomes the conduit. And the most extraordinary demonstration of that ability is John's capacity to manifest a Green Lantern ring into existence, which is crazy as his creation is conceived through sheer willpower. That's arguably the clearest comic book evidence for the idea that, at his absolute upper limit, John's power doesn't necessarily need to begin with a ring as it becomes the expression of his will, rather than the source of it. This also fits neatly with how John's powers have evolved across different comic eras because his constructs have always been defined by an unusually technical understanding of what he creates. However, once John's physiology ascends, the same ability is no longer confined to a conventional power ring, because now his imagination and will can directly produce the kind of hard light manifestations that the ring previously enabled. If Lanterns is deliberately planting the seed for something like this, the bird could represent an early uncontrolled version of that ability. Rather than John already possessing the full powers of his ascendant comic book counterpart, the bird could be a clue that his connection to the green light is becoming internalized. Plus, there's that scene in the preview for the next episode where the green light splashes on John's face when he was a baby. That's why he may not yet understand how he created it or why it continues to exist. But the important implication would be that John is beginning to manifest willpower independently of the conventional rules governing a Green Lantern ring. The Ultraviolet storyline is very important when it comes to proving how John's powers can work independently without the ring. So in Scott Snyder and Jorge Jimenez's Justice League Volume 4, John Stewart becomes one of the clearest examples with the Lantern power becoming less dependent on a conventional ring. In fact, this is the story that first introduced the invisible emotional spectrum, which was previously a hidden portion of the emotional spectrum that feeds on negative emotions such as guilt, shame, hatred, and self-destructive impulses. It was Umbrax, a sentient living black sun, that effectively functioned as the power source for the Ultraviolet core. In the second issue of Justice League Volume 4, Sinestro deliberately unlocks the invisible spectrum, as he believes John is the ideal first recruit due to his buried guilt that he's been repressing, particularly after the destruction of Xanshi. Rather than drawing power from John's positive emotions in a way that the Green Lantern normally does, Umbrax basically fed on those darker feelings and used them to overwhelm his mind. That is how John became the first major human Ultraviolet Lantern, and turned against the Justice League, attacking Flash, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman in the process. The important part of the story is that John's own emotional strength became the battlefield, as the invisible spectrum did not simply give him more power, but rather tried to take control of the person wielding it. The confrontation continued into Justice League issue 3, where John was still under the influence of the ultraviolet spectrum, before eventually being knocked unconscious by Cyborg, which gave enough time to the Justice League to learn what had happened to him. When John finally came around, he explained that the invisible spectrum operated differently from the other emotional lights, because instead of simply allowing its user to channel an emotion into power, Umbrax itself feeds on the negative emotions of beings within its reach. John's guilt over Xanshi therefore became the weakness that Sinestro and Umbrax ended up exploiting. Eventually, when John and Cyborg confronted Sinestro while investigating Umbrax, the villain attacked John and destroyed his Green Lantern ring in the process. However, instead of leaving John powerless, he forces the ultraviolet energy into him at the cellular level, and at this point, the story begins moving away from the traditional idea of John simply being a man who wears a power ring, as the ultraviolet energy has effectively been integrated into his body. What makes John's transformation particularly interesting is that the ultraviolet core itself already operates differently from the traditional Lantern core. The members of Ultraviolet do not wear conventional physical rings, as their power can manifest as a symbol or tattoo on the body. The ultraviolet ring is essentially branded onto the user's skin and serves as a conduit for Umbrax's energy. But in John's case, this becomes even more significant because he eventually refuses to remain a puppet of Umbrax. Honestly speaking, everything boils down to your willpower when you're a Green Lantern, and John's escape from the invisible spectrum is ultimately a test of that quality that defines him as a Green Lantern. He realized that he can't defeat the invisible spectrum by overpowering it, and had to confront the negative emotions that Umbrax was exploiting. By acknowledging his guilt, shame, and regret with the help of Cyborg, John could finally free himself from the control of Umbrax. Because once John recognized that he could overcome the invisible spectrum's power rather than merely fighting it, he was able to regain control of himself. This becomes especially important during the final confrontation with Umbrax, as the League realizes that the solution isn't to simply destroy every ultraviolet lantern that exists, and so they help confront the negative emotions that Umbrax is using against them. After Umbrax is defeated and banished, a new Green Lantern ring appears on John's finger, and he uses it against Sinestro, forcing him to retreat. So the story doesn't quite end with John becoming permanently ringless. Instead, it leaves him in a strange middle ground where the traditional Green Lantern ring has been destroyed. His body has been infused with another form of Lantern energy, and the eventual Green Lantern symbol becomes physically integrated into his body. What could John Stewart's white light powers mean for the Lantern series? I believe there's an important distinction to make before connecting John Stewart to the white light, as the comics have not established Earth Prime John Stewart as a conventional White Lantern the same way they've established characters such as Sinestro, Hal Jordan, or Kyle Rayner. The white light storyline begins with Blackest Night issue 7, when the life entity is revealed to be a living embodiment of life itself. So if Lanterns ever takes John in this direction, it'll be rather a speculative evolution of his powers than something already confirmed in the comic. The life entity is fundamentally different from the green light John normally channels, as it represents life and creation itself, and is also the force triggered by the beginning of life in the universe. The entity eventually became the source from which the emotional spectrum developed. making the white light something considerably more fundamental than any individual color. In the comics, Ganthet revealed the entity's existence after Necron's forces located it beneath Earth. When Necron attacked it, its pain was felt by living beings across the universe. The entity then bonded with Sinestro, making him the first White Lantern. That transformation pretty much gave us a glimpse of how different White Lantern abilities are from ordinary Green Lantern constructs. A Green Lantern uses willpower to create hard light objects, weapons, and machines. But the white light is connected to the power of life itself, which means White Lantern rings can still produce energy constructs and provide the usual Lantern abilities, such as flight and protective energy. But their defining capability is their connection to life and creation. Their most dramatic demonstration comes when Hal Jordan becomes the entity's host after Sinestro is separated from it. Apparently, Hal used the white light to restore heroes who had been turned into Black Lanterns, and helped sever Necron's connection to the living world. The white light is therefore actually capable of restoring life, which is something a normal Green Lantern ring can't do. Hal's use of the entity also allowed the creation of more White Lantern rings, thus showing that the power can also fundamentally alter the state of other Lantern energies. White Lantern power operates on a different conceptual level because if green represents willpower, white represents life, which means it can affect the underlying condition of all living things. I'm talking about resurrection, healing, creation of life, and manipulation of the broader emotional spectrum. Not just that White Lanterns can produce white energy constructs, but those constructs are powered by the energy of life rather than simply the green light of willpower. How cool is that? This is where the theory becomes interesting for Lanterns, because it's important not to overstate the comic evidence as there's no established storyline in the sources above, where John Stewart becomes the Earth Prime White Lantern because of the life entity. The White Lanterns created during Blackest Night are a separate development, and John's role during the event is primarily as a Green Lantern fighting the Black Lantern invasion. In fact, John is among the Lanterns warning Hal about the scale of the Blackest Night before the Seven Corps unite against Necron. However, there's a comic version of John who becomes a White Lantern in the 6th Dimension storyline. This is actually an older or future variation of John Stewart, who first appears in Justice League issue 19 and is explicitly depicted as a White Lantern who owns the White Lantern ring and the power battery. But this version is not evidence that Prime Earth John has secretly possessed white light abilities all along. That distinction actually makes the Lanterns theory more interesting, as John has an unusually strong relationship with the mechanics of Green Lantern power. So if the show ever wanted to push John toward the white light, there is a conceptual progression available to it. John begins by using willpower to create extraordinarily sophisticated constructs, which means that his connection to the Lantern energy will become increasingly internalized. Eventually, if the series produced the life entity or another manifestation of white light, John's abilities could evolve from creating things through willpower to actually manipulating the life force that makes those things possible. That could make the bird particularly interesting because, irrespective of tangible Green Lantern creations, if John's creation were somehow connected to the white light, the bird could represent a manifestation with an actual life force of its own. That would be a huge escalation because the distinction would no longer be whether John can make detailed constructs without the ring, but whether he can create something that can possess a genuine life. And that's where the white light becomes a potentially fascinating endgame for the character. If the show actually follows that route, John's imagination wouldn't merely be shaping hard light anymore, but potentially be imbuing that creation with life. However, that's just my 2 cents. Where do you guys think John's powers as the next Green Lantern is heading? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe, and make sure to ring that notification bell so you don't miss any more of our marvelous video. My name's Drew. Stay safe, and as always, stay marvelous.